The following program is a presentation of the Interfaith Broadcasting Commission.
We shall not be moved.
The great bayous of the southern United States.
We shall not
Stately trees hold faithful vigil.
be moved like a tree planted by the water.
Majestic and strong, their roots run deep.
Shall not
But in 2005, these trees trembled. Her name was Katrina, one of the costliest, deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history. Although she churned across 6 states, leaving billions of dollars of damage and killing almost 2,000 people, Katrina will forever be linked to New Orleans.
I'm a native of New Orleans. I love this city with all my heart. There are many definitions of what New Orleans is. I think my favorite is New Orleans is actually an outdoor insane asylum sitting on a sponge. And unfortunately, that sponge got very, very wet.
While Katrina never did hit New Orleans directly, she left enough wind and rain behind to flood 80% of the city.
wind and rain. We shall
Many thought New Orleans was dead. Chaos and suffering engulfed the city.
People needed us here. Whatever happened, we would be here for the people.
New Orleans has a rich history with the Sisters, dating all the way back to 1727.
For us, New Orleans was a place where God wanted us.
They always had a heart for the poor. So often their ministries were in the poorest of neighborhoods and therefore the most low-lying.
The floods devastated the lives and works of the city's Catholic sisters. Like the mighty trees battered by Katrina's winds, the sisters faced their own relentless storms. Would their roots, sunk deep in the soil of New Orleans for almost 300 years, hold them fast? Like these trees, would they endure?
shall not be moved.
New Orleans sits in a bowl. 50% of it sits below sea level. You've got the lake on one side of it and the river on the other, and in this little bowl sits New Orleans. New Orleans was always fearful of every storm that came our way. But if the right storm came, there was the fear that Lake Pontchartrain could be pushed back on top of the city. When would the flooding stop? It would only stop when the lake had nowhere else to go, when it and New Orleans were at the same water level. After the flooding, New Orleans is filled with water. Some levels at 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet, out here close to the lake, almost 14 feet of water. So it took 2-3 weeks, even 4 weeks in some neighborhoods, to get rid of all that water.
On August 29, 2005, at about 6:30 a.m., water surged up the Intercoastal Waterway towards East New Orleans. Soon, several ministries of the Sisters of the Holy Family began to flood. Founded in New Orleans in 1842 by Henriette de Lille, a free woman of color and a descendant of a slave, most Sisters of the Holy Family are African American. For over 170 years, they have educated some of the poorest children in New Orleans and have cared for the elderly at La Fawn Nursing Home. While some New Orleans nursing homes evacuated their residents, most did not. La Fawn was among these, choosing to ride out Katrina as it had other storms.
Well, I got over here and it was busy, everybody was buzzing around, and they were not going to evacuate. and I didn't have a problem with that.
I decided to not evacuate my mother with the rest of our family because we had evacuated previously several times, and the trip is not a pleasant one.
We're not talking about putting a high school band on a bus and saying, let's go.
Although the heart of America went out to New Orleans and to its people, there was always criticism. Why didn't people leave? It was the end of the month. Did you have money left? Did you have a car that would work? What would you do with your animals? Could your elderly parent sit in traffic for 16 to 24 hours? Did you have enough money for a hotel?
As it was, that was a very good decision because it took us 21 hours to get from here to Houston.
I was walking through LaFon Nursing Facility on the day that Katrina decided she would come through. And I see water. It was very high. Immediately, I spun on one foot to begin our evacuation to the second floor.
There are 2 stairwells. We had to carry over 100 people upstairs. My father was a relatively big man. The people who handled him, they did it very gently, and he was very afraid. He held on to the handrail, and I had to peel his hands because, the water is rising.
Upstairs, with plenty of food and water available, the staff and volunteers kept the elderly residents clean and as comfortable as possible in the stifling heat.
We had 14 volunteers. Many of them were relatives of the residents. In addition, we had 24 staff members.
Although the main road was open, no emergency help appeared. A staffer finally reached her brother, who located a bus. 4 days had passed.
The bus was able to take 34 residents to the Houma area.
The bus was air conditioned, and that was the first air conditioning that we had encountered since that Sunday. And this had to be Thursday or Friday morning. They made them comfortable, cleaned them up, got them in a bed, and that was the first time my dad had been in a bed in about 4 or 5 days.
During the time of Hurricane Katrina and our stay, we had 17 deaths.
Nobody knew that this was going to happen.
It's not an easy call to make. It would be, who knew? Who knew?
I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry for the suffering that it caused, but also for those who had to live with it. With the help of FEMA and the support of the Sisters of the Holy Family, we were able to rebuild, and we reopened January 1st, 2010.
Directly across the highway stands the convent and mother house of the Sisters of the Holy Family.
We had a number of our sisters who were elderly and physically challenged. We had 75 of our sisters in residence at the mother house. We evacuated to a retreat center, and that's when we saw how terrible the 9th Ward had been affected.
We're in the lower 9th Ward. Obviously, it took the worst hit. A lot of empty lots, people who've never rebuilt. This is where the barge came through, and right through this wall. And it just flooded not only the lower 9th Ward, but flooded all of St. Bernard at the 12, 14 feet level. Houses were up in trees, cars were in trees, houses were on top of each other. It was the worst devastation of anywhere in Katrina.
Eventually, Sister Sylvia was able to return and view the property damage.
On the first floor is our chapel. It's a very sacred and special place for the sisters. The space where we sit and pray, it was totally destroyed. For me, it was time to move. That was my initial reaction. We were homeless. We had lost everything. We were at a refounding moment. A year later, perhaps, since the Mother House was back in operation, I think the sisters saw this as a signal from God that we need to rebuild.
The financial and emotional support from Catholic sisters and others helped the sisters rebuild.
Even though FEMA helped to rebuild our schools and all of the social building like the LaFawn Nursing Facility, they would not help us build our Mother House and the convent area. And so we had to seek funds for ourselves to do that.
The religious women throughout the United States really delivered on what it means to be sister to one another.
Katrina also completely destroyed the sisters' high school, St. Mary's Academy.
It really looked like a bomb had hit the place. And I realized that St. Mary's days were over. I didn't know who would take care of the poor children, and I decided that I couldn't think about that right now.
I knew we had to be here, and that's part of our charism, to bring compassion, healing, education, and liberation. And the way we do it is through the school.
Slowly, the sisters embraced the challenge of rebuilding St. Mary's Academy, despite the prohibitive cost.
When I told them that we had come to clean our property and to rebuild, their whole demeanor changed. The expression in their faces, you could see hope in their eyes.
When I heard that St. Mary's Academy was going to reopen, I felt overjoyed. I felt complete again.
After 5 years of classes held in trailers, St. Mary's finally celebrated a brand new state-of-the-art school.
Unsuspecting women. Unsuspecting women made this happen.
Everything around us was saying, this cannot be done.
I didn't have a clue of how it could be done. I had no idea of what it entailed.
Oxygen has how many electrons?
Over the past 5 years, we've been in 4 different locations. And now we're finally at our new location. We've been here since February the 11th, 2011.
We were saying, this is God's school, and Henriette DeLille will help us to help God's children.
Now we're crossing over the Industrial Canal, which links our Mississippi on my right and Lake Pontchartrain on my left. And as you can see, the flood wall to my left, this is a brand new flood wall. This is where the biggest devastation took place.
At 7:30 a.m., water poured through breaches in the Industrial Canal, flooding the Bywater district, home to Holy Angel Center and Mother House of the Marionite Sisters of Holy Cross. These sisters arrived in New Orleans in 1848. For over 165 years, they have served in numerous elementary schools, a high school, and Our Lady of Holy Cross College.
We live in an area called Bywater because it's so close to the Mississippi River. And it's a wonderful area. It has more artists and musicians than any part of the city.
Holy Angel Center is located in the upper 9th Ward, and we were at the very edge of the flooding. We're on the cuff of the French Quarter.
Weeks after the flooding, Sister Kay arrived at their small campus to find it taken over by the National Guard as a staging and command center.
I was just overwhelmed with the number of military people, armed military personnel were everywhere on the property. I said, I am the Superior General of the Mary Knights of Holy Cross. I had never used that title before, but I said, how else can I connect with them? The first thing that hit me was this terrible stench. As a nurse, I knew it smelled like death. And even though the building was in darkness, what I could see on the walls and on everything was mildew, mold everywhere. It was like a pall of death everywhere.
The commander gathered the troops and asked Sister Mary Kay to say a few words to them.
I just looked at them, and I thought, how young. They were so young, and they were the first responders. They were the men and women going from house to house, trying to find the bodies, trying to find dead animals. I thanked them, and I asked them to tell their families that we would hold them in prayer.
The Marianites found themselves in financial distress with local banks shut down. Soon, though, offers of help poured in from other sisters all over the country.
Marianites of Holy Cross, good morning.
We would get phone calls, we would get notes, we would get cards from religious women throughout the United States. This connectedness was just so strong. It was more overwhelming than the devastation.
Catherine, how long has your water been off?
Since Friday.
We soon became a center where people would come knocking on the doors saying, "Can you help? Do you know somebody that can help? This is my need." So it was very obvious to us that we were needed here.
We knew people were going to have a very hard time. Before Katrina, 35% of the people in this area were living below the poverty level, and we knew that would be an even higher percentage. How much do you owe?
$500.
So we can help you with that.
Despite their own losses, the sisters offered Bywater residents modest checks that helped pay basic living expenses.
We've helped about 850 families now. The great percentage has been for their utility bills. Utilities, the cost of utilities has really risen since Katrina. Rents also have gone up drastically. They're 2 and 3 times higher than they were. Our maximum is $200. It doesn't always pay the whole bill, but it tells landlords and the utility company that people are trying.
Often people get confused and they say, oh, the levees broke. The big mounds of earth, those kind of levees that were never going to break, they were all along the Mississippi River. And then there were flood walls, which were built along the canals that carried the water out to the lake. Whether it was engineering, whether it was a lack of ongoing maintenance, it was those flood walls that gave way, not the levees. This is one of the canals, being London Street, that actually failed. And as you look, you can see all of this having been rebuilt. But it was right here that it failed.
Later that morning, water poured through breaches in the London Avenue Canal, flooding the provincial house of the Sisters of St. Joseph on Mirabeau Avenue. The Sisters of St. Joseph were founded in Le Puy, France, in 1650. In 1858, they arrived in New Orleans. For over 154 years, the sisters have served the city at their high school, St. Joseph Academy, in elementary schools, and in various other ministries.
In the early 1950s, our community bought property out on Mirabeau Avenue, so we built 3 buildings on that property.
It was the place where everyone started their religious life. It was the place where we had the vow ceremonies, the place where we celebrated jubilees. It was like our home base.
About 5 feet of water flooded the buildings at Mirabeau. It had to be completely dried out and cleaned out and gutted out.
Almost 10 months later, following extensive cleanup and expense, another tragedy struck.
We got a phone call. Mirabeau was on fire. lightning had struck a nail on the roof, and that caused the roof to catch fire of the main building. When the firefighters came to put the fire out, there was still not enough water pressure in the city, especially out in that area. They had brought helicopters and scooped water up from Bayou St. John and dropped it on the fire on the roof of the building. Put the fire out, but it also went through the whole building, and so it was really ruined again.
Intense discussions took place among the Sisters of St. Joseph. Should they rebuild Mirabeau? Could they?
Here we were with a building that was fire and water damaged. The other buildings still dried out but empty. We could not in any way pay for security 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was a prime target for looters. And the looting just got worse as time went on. We felt with the fire and the flood and the looting, there was really no way to save the Mirabeau buildings.
Today, the Mirabeau property stands empty, and the loss of their home has been painful to the sisters. However, they remain committed to New Orleans.
People say, where are the Sisters of St. Joseph? And we say, they're here. They're working in different ministries.
One of the sisters' oldest and largest ministries is the People Program.
The People Program began in the fall of 1974, and we have grown today to over 550 members with over 140 teachers.
I'm going to add these little ones right here.
There has always been a very, very strong sense of mission, sense of support from the Sisters of St. Joseph. After the storm, with so much destroyed, there were reasonable arguments for abandoning the program. That didn't happen, and the congregation purchased this building so that we could have a permanent home.
So once it starts, it happens very, very fast.
I'm a Sister of St. Joseph. I'm an instructor. I facilitate scripture classes, and I'm delighted to say I also facilitate a class on the life of birds.
I started off with art classes, and then I went to try dance class. I have 2 left feet, but that's all right. People are very patient here.
I love what this program does for people. I love what it does for me.
If I didn't come to the People Program, I have a fear that I'd become a couch potato, and I don't want that at all.
What we want to do is serve the neighbor, and the People Program allows us to do that. In this area, there is such a variety of cultures, religions, races even, and the People Program welcomes that and celebrates that. Everybody is welcome.
Amen. The Sisters of St. Joseph are still in New Orleans, and we hope to be here for many more years.
The convent of the Ursuline Sisters, also located in Mirabeau Avenue, flooded with water from the breached London Avenue Canal. Founded in 1876 by St. Henry de Osso in Tortosa, Spain, the Sisters of the Society of St. Teresa of Jesus serve in 24 different countries. They arrived in New Orleans in 1915.
In the United States, not only we are small in numbers, but we don't own anything whatsoever.
Although we don't have institutions, we work for parishes and for the diocese. Some sisters work on spirituality centers, hospice, and parishes. We have a retreat center here, and it's very active on weekends. I usually help with music, and I'm also available for spiritual direction during the retreats.
As Katrina approached, the sisters evacuated north of Lake Pontchartrain, wondering how and if their convent in New Orleans would survive.
At the time of Katrina, there were 7 sisters that were living in this house.
So as soon as we could, we wanted to see our convent.
The house was submerged under 8 feet of water.
We went into the chapel and everything was down. The statues were on the floor, the books were wet, the pews were upside down, the altar was upside down. It was horrible.
The sisters themselves, with help from friends and parishioners, performed most of the convent cleanup.
We emptied the whole floor and we removed the carpets. We did all of that, and then it got to the point where it was a matter of just tearing down the walls. Even though they were so wet, you could just touch them and they would just crumble too. Everything would crumble.
A lot of questions began just piling up. What are we going to do? We don't have a lot of financial resources. We have lost practically one of our best houses. Are we going to put money into rebuilding it? Are we just getting this as a sign from God that we should not be in New Orleans and just disappear from the city?
The sisters struggled with this question and prayed over it before coming to a unified decision.
We are not called to be in places of privilege or to be in places of comfort. We are supposed to be there where the interests of Jesus are in most danger.
So a decision was made to rebuild, even though the sisters had no way to finance the project.
I was provincial and developer, so all the checks came to me, and I would go with a check running. $25,000 came today from this place. $10,000 came today from this place. I could not believe it. Never on earth I have experienced what real generosity is. From people that do not know you, but trust you and believe that God wants you to continue doing His work. And to me, until the day I die, Katrina will always be synonym of the generosity of the United States.
We shall not be moved. The Catholic Sisters of New Orleans will return in a moment.
The Congregation of Our Lady of Mount Carmel arrived in New Orleans in 1833. By 1840, the sisters had opened both a boarding school and a day school. In 1926, they purchased 7 acres of land in Lakeview, swampland reclaimed from Lake Pontchartrain. The sisters settled there, building both their convent and Mount Carmel Academy. They have served New Orleans for over 179 years. Around 9:45 a.m., the 17th Street Canal breached on its east side, releasing a wall of water into the Lakeview neighborhood. The ministries of the Sisters of Mount Carmel were flooded with 8 to 10 feet of water.
The pumping stations weren't designed to get rid of that kind of water. They were designed to get rid of a couple of inches of water. So it took 2, 3 weeks, even 4 weeks in some neighborhoods, to get rid of all that water.
There were voices saying, "Why ever did you live there anyway? Who ever heard of living below sea level? Why did Mother Clare build a mother house on what was once swampland? Why? We were filled with whys."
Ahead of the storm, Sister Beth had evacuated north of the city. There she heard that the flood walls had breached.
I knew that a breach meant that the lake was going to pour into the city until it equalized. I just knew what it meant. I had a visual picture of it, and it took my breath away.
Mount Carmel Academy president, Sister Camille Ann Campbell, was out of town when the flooding began.
We received a phone call from one of the men on the board who said, "Sister, the levees broke by the 17th Street Canal, and probably the London Avenue Canal will also break. You're caught in the middle. The school will be submerged." Well, that was like an unbelievable message to hear. We had 10 to 10.5 feet in most areas of the campus, and so we had to rebuild everything. The yard was unrecognizable. We had boats on the front steps, boats on the fences in front of our gym that floated over from the yacht club a good distance away. I knew the school had to come back because of the large number we served and what it's meant all the years in Lakeview.
If you don't open up your schools and you don't take back your children, their parents don't come. And you cannot move on with your life, whether it be your job or rebuilding your house, unless you know your children are secure.
We are supposed to be women of faith, women of hope. And if we chose not to come back, all of these people would lose hope. And so I felt a personal sense of obligation to bring the school back.
However, Sister Camille Ann found herself unable to supervise the rebuilding after the flood.
Sister has had a heart condition for quite some time, and she ended up in the hospital with the stress of all of it.
Beth Ann herself assumed day-to-day decision-making in order to meet an ambitious goal: to reopen the school in January of 2006, thereby missing only one semester. The biggest problem was a complete lack of water service. The solution? The school dug its own well.
It was 800 feet deep into the ground. That enabled us to have people on site. They lived here throughout the whole time, and we had fresh water. They could eat, they could dine, they could clean, they could have bathroom facilities, and they lived on our property until that time that we returned. So it was a blessing. It was a real big blessing.
It was amazing to experience the goodness and the generosity from so many people who had great losses of their own. One of the girls at LSU who had just graduated sent me $2 in an envelope. You know, said, "Sister, I really don't have much money because we lost our house, but I want to help my school."
We had an alum that contacted us that worked for Aramco, and the King of Saudi Arabia was willing to make a donation to all the devastated areas with Katrina. And his donation was $300,000. And his intention was, because he is a Muslim, not to buy any type of religious articles. So his gift enabled us to provide all the first floor classrooms with desks as well as lockers. And the girls love those Saudi Arabian desks.
The administrators felt that reopening quickly was important for the girls who had been so traumatized by Katrina.
They had lost their homes, they had lost family members. We tried to bring them back to an environment where we knew we could take care of them, nurture them, and give them a new sense of normal.
We called a meeting of as many of the senior class because that was the most concerned group of individuals. They wanted to graduate from their school.
First thing I thought was, what, am I going to be able to graduate? Because, you know, it's been 3 years.
And I said to them, when we come back in January, you will have grass and there will be plants and flowers in the spring. And I said, Beth Ann is going to make it happen.
And we did. It's just a sign of life, and it was a sign of hope because there was nothing else around, so they could see that we could come back to what we were before.
The school did meet its impossible deadline, welcoming students and teachers back to school in January 2006.
That morning, we saw the parents dropping off the girls and girls getting out of the cars, rejoicing, laughing, crying all at the same time, going down the hall to the one place we could meet, which was the school cafeteria. And when Beth Ann and I walked in, just to see them, my heart was just pounding in my chest because they were so happy. They started applauding and they clapped and clapped. And we had a hard time stopping it because it was so joyful.
My daughter was able to come back and rejoin all of her friends, and it was such a day of celebration.
We lived the whole year in that one semester. We made every moment worth it.
My graduation day from Mount Carmel, it's probably one of those moments I never will forget.
As a Carmelite sister, I was grounded in a belief that God is found in all the circumstances of your lives. And that belief was strongly tested at the time of Katrina. Maybe for the first time we walked a little bit of that walk with Jesus in my life. I lost everything in my bedroom. I lost everything in my office. But I didn't need any of it. I'm sorry.
Right next to Mount Carmel Academy is the Sisters Convent. Here, the sisters welcomed neighbors fleeing from their own flooded homes.
We took the boats through the neighborhood and we would rescue people off the roof, off the second story, take them back here.
The water was so high that they could drop them off on what we nicknamed the Carmel Dock. And all they had to do was climb out the boat And then we would take them upstairs to give them water or food.
The floodwater had stopped just below the second floor, creating a surreal contrast between the upstairs and downstairs.
When I walked upstairs, it was being in another world. It was serene. My bedroom was like I left it before the storm. And I felt so overcome with grief and tiredness. I wanted to curl up on the bed and go to sleep and wake up in my own life.
What I have to say right now is not going to be happy news.
Sister Beth found it painful to relocate the elderly sisters multiple times while she tried to find safe lodging for them.
When I went to tell them that we would have to move again from Lafayette to Lacombe, I could see in Mother Dorothy's eyes tears. And so I went to her and I put my arms on her shoulders and I said, "I'm so sorry that I have to do this to you." And she looked at me and she said, "Beth, I'll be obedient." Now, she was a former superior general, and to have her say so meekly, "Beth, I'll be obedient," it was just so beautiful, so humbling, and made me feel like a criminal that I had to move her. And she died the week she moved to Lafayette of a massive heart attack. At 92 years old, however.
The sisters had been long aware that their property, so close to Lake Pontchartrain, might flood again. Some struggled with the question of rebuilding.
Part of what drew us back was, you know, if we come back, if we provide something of the beauty and goodness and love that was here before, then others will come. If you build it, they will come. Maybe. Or is that really imprudent and stupid and Pollyanna?
Everybody would say, "Are we coming back or not?" Eventually, when the word got around, you could see lights in the mother house that the sisters were back. It was an inspiration for us. And they had the guts to come back with their feet on the ground and rebuild.
It was amazing to have neighbors and people that were driving through the area. They would toot the horn and raise a thumbs up and say, "Thank you, thank you, thank you."
Aside from the damage to Mount Carmel Academy, the sisters also faced massive costs in rebuilding their Mother House convent.
The first donation we got, it was $1,300, came from the poor. And that was repeated over and over and over again, the poor and the wealthy. It became apparent that we were loved. And you can get through anything when you know you're loved.
The Mother House building also houses a lively child care center called Cub Corner.
At Cub Corner, we have 126 children, and we have a staff of 30. Everything was torn and buckled, and the mold had already started growing. You wondered, will we ever be able to do this? And day by day, we did a little bit more. The homecoming was quite spectacular.
You might still need to hold my book.
We had families who had been waiting to come back over here. There were a lot of tears shed, and there were a lot of oohs and ahs over the beauty of the place.
I never worried about my child. Never worried about them while they were here.
It's just not a daycare. They also learn values. They have this wonderful home atmosphere.
Never use glue by themselves.
Let nothing disturb thee, nothing affright thee. All things are passing, God alone suffices. So many women religious love that prayer, and it's true. God really is enough for the human heart.
Back in Gentilly, the flooding continued, submerging Pontchartrain Park and St. Gabriel the Archangel Catholic Church.
It went everywhere from 8 to 9 feet all the way to 10 and 12 feet in some of the areas.
Several weeks passed before Sister Kathleen and Pastor Doug Duson were able to visit the church for the first time.
It's surreal. It was like you were looking at something in a movie, although it was very real. No birds, no animal life, nothing. You know, just eerie silence. The pews were just broken up. Everything was covered with that mud and mold.
We realized we didn't have a parish anymore. People had fled. And so there was no St. Gabriel Parish. So we were very hesitant to encourage people to come back because would the city come back?
A true sister of St. Joseph is one who's ready to do whatever needs to be done. Here is our opportunity, those of us from New Orleans, and our whole community really, to be true sisters of St. Joseph, to say, well, what is it we need to do?
With the help of volunteers from all over the country, the parish began its long journey toward reopening.
We had over 1,500 volunteers come. I don't think I knew what it meant to be grateful until all of that began to happen. We just felt speechless.
In November 2005, the church had been restored enough to celebrate Mass on the first Sunday of Advent.
We didn't really know how many people would show up. And we were hoping at least 25 or 30 or whatever. But here, 300 people came. And that was like the kingdom. I mean, people were just so happy to see one another. And there were a lot of tears shed. There were a lot of hugs. The community was back. The second Mass wasn't until January 2006. That was when we had the first baptism.
I knew we had no lights in the church, no baptism font or anything, but I told Sister we're going to baptize him. So we brought our bowl from home.
We didn't have pews, we had folding chairs, but we were able to get a large group of our parishioners together to come back into the church and celebrate his baptism with us.
When St. Gabriel came back, it meant everything to us. It meant home. It meant that we were home.
Were it not for St. Gabriel, the neighborhood would not have come back as much as it has.
We've said many times, we have died and come back to life. It's a resurrection story. God always plants seeds of new life in those waters, and you just have to wait for those seeds to grow.
The flooding gradually slowed. By noon 4 days later, the last of the waters reached Midtown, home of Ursuline Academy and the convent of the Ursuline Sisters. The Ursuline Sisters arrived in New Orleans from France in 1727, only 9 years after the founding of the city. Immediately they began teaching at a time when the United States was not even a unified country.
Ursuline Academy is 285 years old and the oldest all-girls continually operating school and the oldest Catholic school in the United States of America. We have 4 divisions.
Number 6.
The early childhood are our 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-old full-day programs.
Ouch. How do you spell ouch?
The lower school is 1st through 4th grade. A middle school.
All of those things are programs.
And a high school. We had on the back end of campus 4 feet of water, on the front end of campus 6 feet of water. We lost 40 to 50 trees. All 8 buildings on campus were severely damaged. The electrical and mechanical units were in the basement, and that's where all the water went, gravity to the lowest point. We thought with 8 buildings we could get the main educational building up and running in 3 months. We realized that everything wouldn't be perfect, everything wouldn't even be ready, but we would be open.
After 4 months of intense work, Ursuline Academy and the National Shrine of Our Lady of Prompt Succor did reopen the first week of January 2006.
Prompt Succor meaning quick help. The Sisters have made a commitment to the city of New Orleans since the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 that a Mass of Thanksgiving would be said every feast day of Our Lady of Prompt Succor, January 8th.
The first day back to school at Ursuline Academy was unlike any other in its long history.
It was just screaming and hollering and glee. The joy of these, especially the younger ones, being able to see their friends after so long.
I don't even know if we really taught anything, quite honestly. While sad at the same time because the trees were gone and the auditorium was gone and our brand new gym was gone. But the people and the spirit kept you going and kept you coming back the next day and the next and made it Ursuline again.
The exterior of Ursuline had fallen. It had lost its trees. We had so many buildings that needed to be renovated, but the soul, the interior of Ursuline was so intact.
The 12 trees that died because of the toxicity of the water in the Sacred Heart courtyard were symbols of the original 12 Ursuline Sisters who came to New Orleans.
The children helped with that planting, and we blessed the tree the first day.
I think girls are taught that they can change the world.
Singing is really hard work.
And not just change it, but to make it more human and more just. I think that's what the Ursuline ultimate goal is.
As water rose in the streets around them, the Ursuline Sisters also opened their doors to their neighbors.
In all, we had 20 people, and the youngest was 4 at that point. We did have a family come later with a little 2-year-old, and the oldest was 93, one of our sisters.
In the convent, we had men and women and children and dogs, but I was okay with that. They were welcome.
I was here with my wife and my 4 sons, my mother, and other siblings.
During the storm, I was lucky enough to stay here at the convent for refuge. During the day, I would go out in my boat and just check on other people in the neighborhood.
Sister Damien knew I was in my house and that I didn't want to leave. So she sent the boys on a Wednesday to get me out, but I wouldn't go.
I have a pirogue, which is it's a flat bottom boat, very shallow draft. You can go in water maybe 4 inches deep, so it was ideal for hurricane situation.
Thursday they came back in a pirogue and they said, Sister Damien says you have to leave because we're not coming back.
The water was probably a couple of feet into our house at that point, and it was a wooden door that was swollen, so we had to just bust the door down, basically, to get into our house together.
We rowed out and paddled all the way down to the convent.
Hurricane Katrina hit us at the end of August, which is the hottest time of year in New Orleans. All the heat has built up. And this building was built before air conditioning, so we were able to get some of the windows open. But it was really hot, and since we couldn't bathe, you know, we were hot and stinky.
The weather was terribly hot. I felt it very much. We all did. It must have been about 115. It was very quite hotter than ever before.
One day I was up working in the archives on 3rd floor, and I thought, what can I do about the heat? Nothing. So I had these manila folders, and I made these fans and gave them on. They helped.
One of the places where we could catch a breeze was a little porch area. And it was just kind of a place to hang out, and then other people could come by and sit down and chat for a few minutes. Many people stayed glued to the radios and the TV, and that was their therapy. I, on the other hand, only wanted to know the basics because it was very traumatic and frightening, and I was responsible for this house full of people. I thought about, now what will I do if someone dies? You know, where would we put the body?
Even though there was no electricity from the beginning, we did have gas And so we were able to serve hot meals. And occasionally we did have sandwiches.
One of the ways in which we were able to build community was to have a daily communion service.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians.
We did have a flashlight for the person doing the reading and a lantern on the altar so that I could read the prayers of the communion service from the altar. Behold the Lamb of God. Behold the one who takes away the sins of our world. Happy are we to be called to this table. Not only was it comforting to know that we were in God's presence, but we were praying for our city. Our city was broken.
Word came that the convent would be evacuated the next day. Anticipating that, Sister Carolyn removed a special statue of Mary, nicknamed Sweetheart, from the shrine.
It was brought over from France, and the sisters had it in the attic at the time of a fire in the French Quarter. And one of the sisters remembered that it was there, ran up to the attic, put the statue in the window, and said, "Mary, help us or we're lost." And at that moment, the wind changed and the fire blew out and they were saved. So that statue has a very special part of our history. I went into the little alcove and opened the case and took the statue out and wrapped her up so she would be carefully preserved, and put her in a backpack to carry her with us.
The next day, men arrived in boats, announcing they would evacuate only the sisters. Sister Carolyn rejected that plan.
And he said, "I'm here to evacuate 9 nuns." And I said, "The 9 nuns won't go unless you can take everybody."
Little boats were there that we could get in about 6 at a time. And we had to climb down from the steps. And you had 90-year-old women getting into these little boats.
I was a little afraid to get into the boat, but I managed.
As we were leaving, the thought occurred to me that there had never been a time since 1727 when there would not be an Ursuline in New Orleans.
They took us to Baton Rouge, and from there, everybody was picked up. People who had no family went with the sisters to Dallas.
They came in with one little bag of a few belongings, and they couldn't wait to get a shower, to sleep in an air-conditioned room, and to get some clean clothes. And it was just a wonderful reunion.
I spent 6 wonderful, happy weeks there. I wanted to stay, but they wouldn't let me join.
I was never worried that Ursuline would abandon New Orleans. That'll never be.
They were back quickly within 8 to 9 weeks. People don't think of the city of New Orleans without thinking of the Ursuline Sisters and what they've meant to the city for almost 3 centuries.
People are still coming to help restore our city. To me, that is such a great sign of hope and a sign of the presence of God.
I see New Orleans rebounding stronger and more beautiful than ever before. It's got great leadership, all right? It has great nuns.
The Sisters of Mount Carmel are incredibly strong, tough, tenacious, but gentle women.
What I remember most from St. Mary's was the opportunity to see women who looked the way that I looked run the school. Women who were intelligent, in charge, and were a spiritual example as well.
The nuns never got enough credit because, as typical, they did it quietly, they did it prayerfully, and they did everything they did with deep humility.
After Katrina, the Catholic Sisters of New Orleans weathered other storms of doubt and worry and fear. But like the trees of the bayous and the many, many sisters who had come before them, these sisters also stood firm. They did not abandon New Orleans, their ministries, or their people. They stood together, rooted deeply in the city they loved.
Someone once said to me, "How could you repay the sisters for all that they've done?" And of course you couldn't. And they wouldn't want to be.
Church of God is marching. We shall not be moved. The Church of God is marching. We shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's planted by the water. Oh, we shall not
God has become much bigger for me. You know, at different times in your life, He grows. He grows.
We learned from that experience lessons that only life can teach you and that only faith can make meaningful.
I know the grace of God was with us and with me, and I believed in God, I hoped in God, and I depended solely on God.
The losses were huge, and they still are being felt. The blessings were also huge.
I am tired of talking about Katrina, and I don't want to be identified with Katrina, with so much more than that storm.
When most of the walls started to be closed in, plastered up, painted over, there was a section of the Congregational Center I hadn't filled in yet. The pipes were still exposed, electrical equipment. And many a day, one of the sisters would say to me, when are we going to finish this? When are we going to close in this wall? And there was something in me just resisting that. It was really a concern. If we close it up, will we forget? If we close it up, will the impact and the lessons of Katrina be put aside?
That event brought out what was best in us as religious women. And I don't ever want to lose that.
We had come together for something higher, bigger, greater than ourselves. I didn't want it to get back to normal ever again. I want us to remember.
So if telling the story periodically enables us to stay in touch with the best in us, and the best in us is the God in us, well, then I'll just keep telling it.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-354-3504. The preceding program was a production of the SC Ministry Foundation.